Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. Today, we're taking a look at the two main variations of the Mosin Nagant M91 barrel band. Here on the left, we have what we're going to be referring to as a early Type 1. Here on the right, we have what we will be referring to as the later Type 2. Now, here on the left is our Type 1. These would come around in the year 1893. Again, for the M91 rifle, the Dragoons and the Cossacks and the 1907 carbines all used the same sort of 9130-ish style of barrel band, which we'll look at in a different video. The only Mosin Nagant made by the Russians to use this barrel band are the M91. Now, Finland also used these, but we'll get into that here in a little bit. Now, the more attentive viewer might ask, well, Big Sam, you said 1893, but the Mosin Nagant M91 is the model of 1891, and we know that there were some made before 1893. And you are correct. You see, what's important here to realize is there's actually three different types of barrel bands for the M91. Technically, this is a Type 2, but for this video, and for all intents and purposes, it's a Type 1. You see, in 1893, the top handguard was introduced for the M91 rifle. And with that, it needed a retention system. That retention system are these barrel bands, the front and the rear. Now, if we see here, these little flat sides right here, this is cut out so the tabs and the handguard can fit through them. Now we have that both on the rear one as well as the front one here. So these wouldn't actually have been present before 1893 because you don't need that because there was no handguard before that anyway. But basically all of the Type 1s are this variety. So for all intents and purposes, there's two different types. So this was introduced in 1893 and would continue to be made right around until about 1910 to 1912, somewhere in there. Now, why did we go away from this type? Well, one of the big reasons is because of things discovered during the Russo-Japanese War. You see, originally, there was a sling swivel here. And pretty much all of these would have a sling swivel attached here. This would have been the front sling swivel. And it was found that this was not a very good idea. It wasn't a very good system. One of the reasons is because these barrel bands, they're kind of thin. And if you've had an M91, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. These can have trouble fitting and actually can become loose. And it can become a real pain. You have to shim them or do all sorts of other things. It's just not a very good design. So during the Russo-Japanese War, it was found that these barrel bands are just not a very good design, and they don't do a very good job of providing tension, and they become loose. Also, that sling swivel was not really good. So around what they did after the Russo-Japanese War was they would remove the sling swivels in favor of actually cutting holes through the stock and having those escutcheons, and you'd strap your sling through those, much like they were already doing on the Dragoons and the Cossack rifles during and before the Russo-Japanese War. Well, as we can see here in our Type 2 later style, these are actually thicker. So let's look at the difference here. We can see this is thicker, and the goal was to provide better tension and clamping the stock to the barrel. And these did do a better job, although these did still have problems eventually. Some of them did, so it's very common to see things like shims and other things, other retention mechanisms. The Finns a lot of times would put a little screw into the stock in front of here, and the screw head would kind of meet up against here, like that, and it would help to prevent this from moving back and forth. So these would have been produced from, a few years before World War I up until the end of Mosin Nagant M91 production in the 1920s. Now, one interesting thing to note here is if we look at this guy, we can see there's actually a hole through here. I can actually stick my Mosin Nagant cleaning tool, the mighty toothpick, through there. Look at that. Why is there a hole through this barrel band? Well, you see, this hole is very indicative that this barrel band was modified by Finland. It's not very well understood, but apparently what Finland did was they would actually put a pin through here, and it would go through the whole stock. Through in one side, through the stock, out the other side. Apparently, though, they got rid of that because you almost never find that pin. It's very uncommon to see that pin. So they did that, and then they decided, we don't need to do that, and so they just replaced it. But of course, the holes are still present. So if you ever see this hole here, that's a really good indication that it was used by Finland. And again, on this guy, we'll take a closer look at some of these and get this focused better. We can see here that we have a Tula hammer. So this would have been on a Tula Mosin Nagant from sometime around 1910, 1912 to the 1920s, sometime in there. Now let's look at this guy. This one is the same year, but it's in a Ijevsk. We can see our bow and arrow right here. There we go. Here's the bow, and there's the arrow right there. Now we look at this guy. We don't really see a maker's mark. There might have been one here, but it's gone by this point. There's an interesting... That's a Russian letter right there. Interesting. And then our other Type 1 barrel band, we can see has quite a lot of character rust and pitting and other bad things. But we can see here, this was actually made by the Sistroyetsk factory. So that's pretty cool. It's always interesting to get to take a look at some really old barrel bands. Now, one other issue that you might come across when, let's say, you're shopping for an M91 barrel band. Let's say you have an M91 rifle or some Finnish variant thereof, and the front one is loose. And so, or what's actually also very common on these is, see this little, it kind of looks like a washer here, this guy right here. It's very common for you to like over tighten this and then for this actually to break off. See, this is actually like, I don't know if these are brazed to the screw or exactly what they did, but it's loosely connected to the screw. But to see if this comes off, then there's no good way to provide, the screw is no longer able to provide tension up against the barrel band and to separate it. So that's a problem. So sometimes that happens, but let's say, for whatever reason, you need a new front barrel band. Well, you might be looking at a listing. I'm going to put this one further back. So how do you tell the difference between the one on the left and the one on the right? How do you know if you're looking at a front barrel band or a rear barrel band? Well, regardless if you're looking at a Type 1 or a Type 2, the easiest way to tell if your barrel band is a front barrel band is it's going to have this little cutout here at the bottom. This cutout is actually for the cleaning rod. So at the very front, this helps keep the cleaning rod in place. At the rear, it doesn't really contact the cleaning rod. And we can see the same thing here on our Type 2s. This is a front barrel band. There's the cutout. Here's our rear later style barrel band. There's no cutout. All right, so that's a really good way to tell. Now, the other weird quirk about these M91 barrel bands is actually how you tighten or loosen them. It's actually the opposite of the opposite of the opposite of what you would expect. You see, let's say I want to loosen a barrel band. Well, we would go with the old saying, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. Except, no, we wouldn't. Because in order to, let's say we want to loosen the barrel band, what you actually have to do is do the opposite. So if I want to loosen this, you might think I would have to turn the screw to the left to loosen it. But actually, if I turn the screw left, it tightens the barrel band. It's the opposite of the opposite of the opposite of what you'd expect. But why is that? Well, we have to look at what's actually happening here. So when we tighten the screw, let's say to turn it to the left, when we're tightening this, what you're actually doing, even though you might think that's how to tighten this, all your tension is actually coming up against this piece here. So when you're tightening it, you're actually moving these threads and tightening the screw, and that's spreading out the barrel band. Because again, your tension is all because of this little guy here at the end. So when I tighten the screw, it's actually putting tension against the barrel band, thus loosening it. So that's another important thing to remember, because if you're not careful with what you're doing here, you over loosen or over tighten this, you could pop this guy off, and then you either have to figure out a way to reattach it. You can weld it back on, but that's kind of a huge pain. You don't want to have to deal with that. A lot of people don't have access to a welder that easily, and it's just not fun. So it's important to remember to not over loosen or over tighten these, and also be aware if you're actually tightening or loosening this, and to make sure you're not doing the opposite of what you think you're doing or what you want to be doing there. Okay, so again, this is the Type 1 M91 barrel band, the rear one. This is a Type 1 front barrel band. This is a Type 2 front barrel band, and we know that because of this little notch. And this guy is a Type 2 rear barrel band. All right, so that was our kind of brief overview of the Mosin Nagant M91 barrel band. Now, I didn't previously mention that Finland would use these. We'll get into this more in our video on the Finnish Mosins Part 2, which is Mosin Nagants that were built by Finland. But they also, so we know that Finland, about almost half of their army, or half of their guns used by the army, were M91 or some variant of the M91 rifle. So they had a lot of M91s that they bought or traded for. They also built a lot of M91s as well, because they had all the parts laying around. They got a lot of parts because they got tons of guns that were useless, and they just had to basically strip them out and, okay, here's the parts, and throw like the barrels or whatever else we can't use away. So they made a lot of M91 rifles, and those would use these same barrel bands. So the Finns would actually use these types of barrel bands here quite a lot, both types. It's very common to see the earlier types as well, because again, in World War I, if you look at pictures from World War I, it's very, even though these technically were supposed to be replaced by World War I, and these actually were not being produced in World War I, a lot of the pictures you'll see of people, if you look carefully, will have the sling swivels on the magazine, and the sling is connected to the magazine. Well, if your sling's connected to the magazine, then it's also going to be connected up here to your barrel band. So if you have a magazine sling swivel, you definitely need to have this Type 1 barrel band. So it's very common to see pictures of World War I with troops of all sorts of different countries using Mosin Nagants with these earlier style barrel band. You'll see some of the later ones, but I would say it's almost more common to see the early ones. Very fascinating. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this overview of the Mosin Nagant M91 barrel band variations. Please let me know if y'all have any prayer requests, and I'll see you next time.